There was once a color you could be executed for wearing. Not a crime, not a weapon, a color. In the ancient world, one specific shade of purple was worth more than gold by weight. Emperors killed for it. Laws were written to control exactly who could touch it, and an ordinary person caught wearing it could lose everything, including their life. But here's the strange part. This color didn't come from a flower, or a gem, or a rare mineral. It came from the rotting bodies of sea snails, thousands of them, crushed, left to decay in the sun until they released a substance so foul that entire factory districts had to be built downwind of every city. The most beautiful color in the ancient world was born from one of the worst smells human beings had ever created. And then, one day, the recipe vanished completely. For centuries, nobody on Earth could make it. The exact method was simply lost. This is the story of the color that killed. The color was called Tyrian purple. It took its name from the city of Tyre, on the coast of what is now Lebanon. And to understand why people died over it, you first have to understand where it came from, because it's genuinely disgusting. The dye was made from sea snails, a particular kind, with a small gland inside that produces a clear fluid. On its own, that fluid is nothing. But when you crack open the shell, extract the gland, and expose it to air and sunlight, it slowly changes. It shifts through green, then blue, and finally into a deep glowing purple-red that does not fade. The problem was the scale. A single snail gives you almost nothing. To dye one garment, you needed thousands of them. Some ancient estimates suggest tens of thousands of snails for a single robe, and every one had to be cracked open by hand. Now imagine that process at industrial scale. Mountains of shellfish, split open and left to rot in shallow vats under the Mediterranean sun. The smell was legendary. Ancient writers described it as unbearable. The dye workshops were pushed to the edges of the city, downwind, because no one could stand to live near them. So the people who made the most luxurious color on earth spent their lives soaked in the stench of decay. The dye even stained their hands and clothes permanently. You could identify a purple worker by the smell alone, and this is where it gets almost poetic. The color that meant power, royalty, and untouchable status was produced by the lowest, most miserable labor in the entire economy. The emperor's robe began its life as rot on a factory floor. Because it was so hard to make, purple became the ultimate signal of power, not just expensive, restricted by law. In Rome, wearing certain shades of purple was tied directly to rank. Over time, the deepest purple was reserved for the emperor alone. To wear it without permission wasn't a fashion choice. It was treason. It suggested you were claiming a status that could get you killed. The color literally marked the boundary between a ruler and everyone else. You could see power. It had a shade. And then the whole thing collapsed. When the Roman Empire in the West fell apart, the vast trade networks that supplied the dye began to break down. The specialized workshops, the trained workers, the supply of snails, the precise knowledge of the process, all of it depended on a stable, connected world. When that world came apart, the knowledge went with it. There was no single book that held the complete recipe. It lived in the hands of workers passed down by doing, not writing. And when those workshops closed and those workers died, the exact method died with them. For centuries afterward, people knew that Tyrian purple had existed. They could see it on old fabrics and read about it in ancient texts, but nobody could reliably reproduce it. The most valuable color in human history became a rumor, a thing the ancients could do, and no one else could. It took modern chemistry, almost 2,000 years later, to finally understand the molecule and work out how they had done it. We think of lost knowledge as grand things, lost cities, lost libraries, but sometimes what disappears is smaller and stranger, a specific smell, a way of cracking a shell, the exact moment to pull a cloth from the vat. An entire civilization built a symbol of ultimate power on the backs of rotting sea snails and then lost the ability to make it at all. The color outlived the empire, but the hands that knew how to make it did not.